Today we're looking at Unit 2, Notes number 7, Progressive Presidents. We're going to be looking at 3 different presidents, Teddy Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. We only have one set of notes to do today in class, so if you finish early, you can go back, look at other notes we've done for this unit, work on your review sheet, finish up key terms. Let's analyze progressivism under Teddy Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt. Before becoming president, he was governor of New York. He fought corruption, broke up political machines, and so ultimately for a lot of people in New York, he was causing problems because he was trying to fix problems. So a lot of people wanted him out of New York. Some of his enemies, people that felt that he was kind of sticking his nose where it didn't belong. So Theodore Roosevelt's Republican enemies decided to nominate him for vice president. So vice president is a very high position, but it's not historically a position that holds a lot of power. You're basically just kind of there in case the president dies. You have certain duties, but it's not, you don't have a say-so in a lot of things. So the people that nominate him felt it's kind of political death. He's going to go out, become VP, get out of New York. So he would run on the party ticket with William McKinley in the 1900 presidential election. So McKinley and Roosevelt win. But in 1901, President McKinley is assassinated. So the vice president then becomes president. So now Theodore Roosevelt, who people had just kind of wanted to get out of their hair in this kind of non-power position, ends up becoming the most powerful person in our country. So now as vice president, he ascends to the presidency. So he's a very young president. I want to say he's like 41 or 42. At the time, he was the youngest person to be president. Trust busting. Theodore Roosevelt believed a powerful government was essential to democracy. So he felt that a government should be strong, should have power. He also saw that regulation is key, and that big business was essential too. But corporate, corrupt, and evil trust hurt people. He felt that the government needed to step in to protect the general welfare. So he saw the benefit of having big business and the fact that they created new products, created competition, helped our economy, provided jobs, but he also felt that those businesses and business leaders had a responsibility to be ethical and to not be corrupt. And so he wanted to help to regulate that, and that's where he saw the government's role. So Theodore Roosevelt used the Sherman Antitrust Act to sue 44 trusts in 7 years in office. So he went after businesses that found loopholes, that created monopolies, that created an unfair hold over their industry. Not all of the firms who were targeted were killed off, but many were, and it began to promote competition. So Teddy Roosevelt became known as a trust buster. So Roosevelt's presidency changed American society by setting a precedent that powerful government should regulate business on behalf of the citizens. So kind of assuming that role of what the government should do, that the government should have a more active role in creating laws and overseeing what businesses are doing. Also expanding the power and role of the president forever in the lives of the public, that the president kind of should have a say-so, should know what's going on, should be a bigger advocate for the people. Also ending abuse and neglect, abusive and negligent corporate practices, and officially ending the Gilded Age. In 1908, Teddy Roosevelt decided not to run for re-election, so he finished out McKinley's term from the 1900 election, ran again in 1904 and won, and then decided he didn't want to be president anymore. So back then there were no term limits. His popularity meant that the Americans wanted more of what Teddy Roosevelt had done. So the next POTUS, the next president of the United States, would need to follow in Theodore Roosevelt's footsteps of reform. Teddy Roosevelt handpicked a trusted friend to run to replace him and continue his legacy. And that man was William Howard Taft. So Taft's legacy. Ultimately, he was known for his failure to continue reforms and that eventually would split the GOP. So the GOP is a term used to reference the Republican Party. It stands for Grand Old Party. It's just another way to reference the Republican Party. So despite busting 90 trusts in 4 years, Taft was never as popular as Roosevelt. His personality was so different. He didn't like the being so much in the public eye. He was more reserved than Roosevelt, where Roosevelt would make lots of speeches, call attention to what he was doing, be more boisterous and animated. Taft did not crave that kind of attention. So even though he was believed in the same things as Roosevelt, did the same stuff that he did in terms of targeting and attacking corrupt trusts, the public just didn't feel a connection to him. So although he was more successful than Theodore Roosevelt in trust busting, he did not get the credit and recognition that Roosevelt did. So we're now in the election of 1912. So Taft, being that he's the incumbent, will run again. However, Roosevelt is not necessarily happy with what he's done as president. So now Roosevelt also wants to run. However, they're from the same political party, so that causes issues. So a new candidate, a Democratic candidate, is Woodrow Wilson. So Woodrow Wilson will eventually win the election. We'll discuss why. So in 1912, Democrat Woodrow Wilson is elected president. So important facts about this election. So the GOP vote, the Republican vote, is split between Taft and Teddy Roosevelt. So ultimately, people can't decide who they want to vote for. So they have the primary, and Taft, because he's the incumbent, wins the primary election. But Roosevelt doesn't sit back and settle for that answer. Instead, he leads a third party, the Bull Moose Party, and runs as a presidential candidate. So there are 3 main people running. And so because Teddy Roosevelt used to be a Republican, still basically is, it splits the vote. And so that splits up the Republicans so that neither one has enough of a majority to defeat Woodrow Wilson. So Americans showed a mandate for progressivism by giving 75% of total votes to progressive candidates. So while Wilson is a Democrat, he also has progressive ideas. So Wilson, a progressive, won this election overwhelmingly. So here's an electoral map of the election of 1912. So all of the blue states were won by Wilson. You have green states were run by Teddy Roosevelt and his third party, Bull Moose Party. And then the red states were won by Taft. So definitely kind of splitting that Republican base did not do them any favors. So Woodrow Wilson is elected in 1912. Power is transferred from Republicans to the Democrats. Wilson, a progressive, set an agenda to continue reforms. Wilson focuses on financial and economic reforms. And so, Woodrow Wilson, so his legacy. He is known as an intelligent reformer, father of the modern financial system. Wilson grew up in the South during the Civil War and Reconstruction. He also served as president of Princeton University and governor of New Jersey prior to becoming president. So he had a lot of knowledge and a different type of background. He had a background within government, being governor, but then as kind of this intellectual person, he had all of these ideas in terms of progressivism, of how he felt he could change the country. In our next unit, when we talk about World War I, he's the author of the 14 Points. So he has all of these great ideas, ideologies of how he feels we can become a better country, a better world. So he is definitely seen as a intellectual elite. So his political philosophy, break up the power of trusts and the financial elite and grant greater freedom to the common American. So while he is a different party than Roosevelt, he's a Democrat, not a Republican, they still have a lot of the same ideas and kind of Their approach to things may be different, but ultimately they do want to see the government take care of the people. Federal Reserve System. So the banking system and monetary systems were in need of overhaul. In 1913, the Federal Reserve Act was signed and it established a national banking system. So prior to this, we would see lots of banking panics. The banks were more independent. So this helped to create a more uniform system to make money and banking more secure. So the U.S. is broken into 12 bank districts. Each district had a regional federal bank. Regional federal banks would issue money, loans to troubled banks to try to prevent failures. The Fed can also control interest rates and make loans easier or harder, raising or lowering the interest rates. And so the Fed is still our banking system. So this is something that Wilson is known for in terms of what he established, still used today. We'll see that after the Great Depression, the Great Crash, some changes are kind of tweaked, but as a country, we learn as we go. We create systems and then fix the issues once we recognize them. So progressivism begins to die. So this whole movement. So as World War I begins to break out in Europe in 1914, momentum for progressive reform died out. And so essentially we had been so concerned with our own domestic issues, rightly so, but as this bigger, more worldly issue comes about, our focus begins to change. So a lot of these progressive reforms get put on the back burner as our attention changes focus. So 3 factors that led to the end of the progressive era. Americans concentrated on remaining neutral. How can we stay out of the war? Wilson and Congress focused on foreign policy. And American industry geared up to make war goods. So our focus is completely shifting towards the war. How are we staying out? What's going on? What's causing the war? Our factories began gearing up in order to make goods for the war. And so ultimately that era begins to die down. So this is the end of Unit 2. So make sure you finished off your summaries for the unit. Your summaries are points. Make sure you finish up your key terms. You can get the review sheet for this unit to prepare for the test on Friday.